I was home alone that Saturday night, my parents gone to visit my aunt 2 towns over. The house felt quieter than usual, almost hollow, but I liked that at first. The autumn air had a damp chill, and the faint scent of cinnamon from the candle I'd lit in the living room spread slowly through the house, mingling with the faint smell of old wood from the floors and the upholstery of the sofa. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and notebooks, doing homework, my pencil scratching against the paper, the sound amplified in the emptiness. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the windows, and the street lamp down by the end of the driveway cast a yellow rectangle across the carpet, fading as it passed over each step of the sidewalk. I had just finished a math problem when I heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps coming from the basement. I froze, pencil halfway to the paper, stomach dropping. The basement door was at the end of the hallway, and I knew it too well. It creaked at the slightest touch, even when the house settled or a breeze caught it just right. But this wasn't a settling sound. These were deliberate 2 steps, pause, 2 more, the kind of measured, slow movement you didn't mistake for anything else. My heart hammering, I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that maybe the house was just settling. But the next sound shattered that theory. A faint scrape, low and dragging, like a chair being moved across the concrete floor. I realized the basement window had been left slightly open since summer. A small latch unclicked to let in fresh air. It was a narrow window, high off the ground, overlooking the side yard where the grass had grown wild and the trash cans sat in a row against the fence. I stood, careful to keep my movements quiet, and crept toward the window, pressing my face close enough to see through the shadows. The yard was dark, but for a moment, I thought I saw something crouched behind the cans. A black shape, low to the ground, almost still, like someone had paused and was waiting for me to notice. My stomach clenched, my throat dry, and I backed away slowly. I locked the basement door, the old metal latch clicking into place with a sound that seemed far too loud in the silence. I went back to my room, shutting the door behind me, and sat on the bed with my back against the wall, knees drawn up, listening. Every creak in the floor sounded magnified, every gust of wind outside like someone breathing just beyond the walls. The house, which had felt safe and ordinary in daylight, felt like it had grown into something else entirely. Cold, watchful, unpredictable. I tried to focus on my homework again, but I couldn't. The shadows seemed to shift around the corners of my room. The ticking of the clock on the wall was no longer a background noise. It was a countdown, each second marking how long I was alone, how long it would take before the sound came back. My gaze kept flicking to the window, half expecting to see movement, a flash of something that didn't belong. I told myself over and over that no one could be in the house. The locks were all functional. The doors were heavy, but the sound of those footsteps and the scrape of the chair refused to leave my mind. Hours passed slowly. I didn't sleep, though I tried, curling under the covers with my flashlight beside me. Every bump, every gust of wind that rattled the window, made my stomach twist. The candle had burned down long ago, leaving the room dim and shadowed, but I didn't dare light another one. The dark felt safer, somehow, as if light might give shape to something I didn't want to see. I imagined the person I thought I had seen outside creeping closer, moving silently along the side of the house. I imagined them watching the front door, watching me, waiting. My hands were clammy, gripping the blanket. My heart refused to slow. Morning came finally, though it didn't bring immediate relief. The street outside was quiet, the wind had died down, and the weak October sun cast pale light across the floorboards. I opened my bedroom door slowly and crept to the basement door, half expecting it to swing open or for the sound of movement to resume. But everything was still. The door was locked as I had left it, and the window in the side yard was closed, just as it had been every other day before that night. Later, when my parents returned, I told them about the steps, the scrape, the shadow outside. They checked the house with me, moving slowly through every room, examining every lock and window. Outside, they lifted the trash cans and peered under the shrubs. Everything was empty. No sign of forced entry, no tracks in the grass, no footprints in the dirt. It was unnerving how complete the absence of evidence was. Weeks passed, and the house returned to normal, but I never forgot that night. I became careful, obsessively so, locking every window, checking every door twice before bed. The basement remained off-limits, the side window always tightly shut. I realized that what I had experienced wasn't supernatural. There was no ghost, no monster. It was just something human, who had been there when I was alone. The thought that someone could move through the house unnoticed, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment when the house felt empty, was far more terrifying than any story I had ever heard. Eventually, I accepted the memory as a lesson in vigilance, a reminder that the world could intrude in the smallest, most ordinary spaces. The candle scent, the creaking floorboards, the dim light, they all became markers of awareness, cues to watch, to listen, to take precautions. I never stayed home alone after that, not without double-checking locks and windows, not without imagining every shadow could conceal someone else. The night had shown me that the ordinary could suddenly feel threatening, that even a familiar house could hide danger, and that silence could mask the presence of someone who shouldn't be there. It was terrifying, and yet, in the end, I had survived. The house was still mine, the locks still worked, and I had learned to see, hear, and anticipate the smallest, most subtle signs. That was the only comfort, the certainty that I could protect myself, and that the threat, though real, had passed. I was home alone for a week while my parents were away on a business trip, and the farmhouse felt emptier than it ever had before. It was late October, the kind of chill that creeps under the door frames and rattles the windows when the wind picks up. The house had a smell of aged wood, dust, and the faint lingering scent of whatever my mother had last cooked. I spent most of the evenings reading or catching up on homework at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the overhead fixture and the dull glow of the table lamp. The house was quiet, but that quiet was different from the usual calm. It was the kind that made every creak and groan of the old floorboards feel deliberate, like the house was alive in a way I had never noticed before. The attic always made me uneasy. It was at the end of a narrow hallway on the second floor, past the spare bedroom, behind a heavy wooden door with a brass lock my dad never let me touch. The lock was old and tarnished, but it worked, and I knew better than to test it. My parents had warned me about the floorboards in the attic. They were unstable, rotten in spots, and the last thing anyone wanted was me tripping through a beam into the space below. The attic smelled faintly of dust, old paper, and the must of furniture that hadn't been moved in decades. My dad kept trunks full of old clothes, rusted tools, and stacks of papers that might have been important once. It was a place that felt like the past pressed down into the present, heavy and dark and easy to forget. It was around 11 o'clock one night when I noticed the first sound. I was lying on the living room couch, half reading a book and half dozing, when I thought I heard it. A faint tapping, soft but deliberate, coming from above. My stomach clenched, but I told myself it was the house settling, a branch brushing the roof, or the pipes shifting with the temperature. The tapping continued, rhythmic, slow, almost methodical. 2 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got up and crept toward the hallway, careful not to make a sound on the old floorboards, and stood outside the attic door. The brass keyhole stared back at me, dark and uninviting, and I waited, heart hammering. First, I saw nothing. The hallway light spilled across the door, casting shadows that stretched and swayed as the house settled. Then I noticed it, a thin flicker of light through the keyhole. It lasted only a second, like a flash, but it was bright enough to see that it was real. Not a reflection, not a trick of the street lamp outside. The attic had no electricity. Nothing in that room could produce a light of its own. I pressed my hand against the door, trying to steady myself, but the cold wood beneath my palm did little to calm me. My mind raced, imagining the possibilities. Someone had to be up there. That was the only explanation. But how could they have gotten in? The house was locked. The windows were all secure. I remembered double-checking them earlier that evening. I backed away slowly, my pulse in my ears, and decided I would not approach the attic that night. I sat on the couch, covering myself with a blanket even though I wasn't cold, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening. Every tap, every creak, Every groan of the old house felt amplified. The tapping eventually stopped, but I couldn't relax. I kept imagining a shadow moving across the floorboards above. Someone crouched among the trunks, examining whatever had drawn their attention. I tried to reason with myself, thinking about prowlers in rural areas being unlikely, about the improbability of someone breaking in and making their way to the attic without leaving a trace. But the flickering light had been real, and the rhythmic tapping was unmistakable. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, moving only to get water or check the locks on the doors and windows. I kept the kitchen knife close, though I didn't want to admit it even to myself. Every sound from the house felt exaggerated. The wind rattling the windows, the heating pipes groaning as they warmed up, even the floorboards creaking under my own weight when I shifted in my chair. All of it made me jump, waiting for something more. Sleep was impossible. The minutes felt like hours. I imagined climbing the stairs to the attic just to confirm that no one was there. But I couldn't bring myself to risk it. The fear of falling through the boards, combined with the knowledge that someone might actually be there, kept me rooted to the couch. By the time dawn came, the world outside had softened. The wind had died down, and the early morning light filtered through the curtains, pale and forgiving. I finally moved from the couch to make some coffee, glancing up at the attic door each time I passed it. The house felt empty again, ordinary in its old, familiar way. My parents arrived later that morning, cheerful and oblivious to the tension that had settled over me. They checked the house with me, as always, walking through every room, opening cupboards, peering under furniture. When we reached the attic door, they tried the lock. It was as it always had been, locked, secure, undisturbed. There was no sign that anyone had been up there. No footprint in the dust, no overturned trunk, nothing. Still, I knew the light had been real. The image of it flickering through the keyhole stayed with me, persistent and inexplicable. I tried to imagine a logical explanation, a reflection from the street lamp outside, a misperception of shadows, even a trick of my own tired eyes, but nothing fit. The attic had no electricity. The light had to have been inside the room. I never found an answer, and I never felt safe being in the house alone again. The experience changed the way I approached the farmhouse. I checked every window multiple times before nightfall, locked every door twice, and never lingered near the attic. The trunks, the dust, and the old furniture no longer felt like forgotten history. They felt like potential hiding places, reminders that the ordinary could conceal something I might never understand. I learned to move through the house carefully, to listen to every sound, and to trust my instincts about what was real. Years later, the memory of that night remains clear. The rhythmic tapping, the flickering light, the way the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch toward me. They are still vivid. There is no supernatural explanation, no ghost or spirit. There was only a house, empty yet unpredictable, and perhaps something or someone that had found a way to enter it unnoticed. I survived the week alone, and the house remained mine, but I never forgot the sensation of being watched, the certainty that the light had existed, and the lesson that the familiar could suddenly become dangerous. I learned that fear could be entirely real, even without proof, and that sometimes the most unsettling presence is one you never see, only sense. I was home alone that Friday evening, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant sound of traffic from the street below. My roommate had gone to a concert, leaving me to settle in with a book and a cup of tea. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the candle I had lit earlier, a scent that usually helped me relax. But that night it did little to calm the slight unease I felt being alone in the building. The walls were thin, and I could hear the faint shuffle of people in neighboring apartments, the occasional thump of someone walking in the hallway. It was normal, ordinary, familiar, and I told myself I was imagining tension where there was none. Around 9:45 p.m., I was sitting on the couch, leaning against a pile of pillows and reading, when something caught my attention in my peripheral vision. A dark shape outside the living room window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the streetlight, the reflection of a tree swaying in the wind, or a shadow from the building across the street. But the shape didn't move like a shadow. It was upright, still, deliberate, My stomach twisted as I realized it was the figure of a person, just standing there, staring directly at the window. I froze, heart racing, my hand tightening around the edge of the book. Our building was 3 stories up. There was no way someone could be at eye level with my window without some sort of equipment, or without hanging dangerously from something outside. I strained to see, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, but the figure remained there, motionless, impossible, just staring. The street below was empty, the fire escape unused, and the balcony adjacent to mine belonged to the apartment next door. It wasn't accessible from my window. It made no sense, and that made it worse. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and called my roommate, keeping the line open though I knew she couldn't do anything from the concert. I edged toward the window slowly, my body pressed to the floor at first, moving like I was testing the ground for stability. The carpet felt soft under my knees, but every creak of the floorboards sounded like it could announce my presence to whoever was outside. The figure didn't move. The air seemed to thicken, the ordinary sounds of the city fading into silence as I focused on that impossible silhouette. I tried to make out any features, but the darkness obscured details. It was the shape, the presence, the certainty of someone being there that made my chest tighten. I inched closer to the window, using the sofa as a shield. My breathing was shallow, careful not to make a sound, and my pulse thumped in my ears. When I was close enough to see the window frame in detail, the figure had vanished. No movement, no trace, nothing. The street below remained empty, the fire escape still unscathed, the lights in the neighboring buildings flickering as they always did. I backed away slowly, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But the memory of that still form, the feeling of being watched from outside, refused to leave me. I sat on the couch for the rest of the night, alternating between peeking toward the window and curling into myself under a blanket. Every noise in the building felt exaggerated. The creak of the heating pipes, the shuffle of someone in the apartment above, the faint click of a door closing in the hallway. Each sound made my heart jump, and I had to remind myself to breathe. The city outside seemed ordinary again. Lights flickering in apartments, cars passing on the street, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure. Eventually, sleep overtook me in short, fitful bursts. I would wake up at every unusual sound, heart hammering, checking the window each time, expecting the figure to have returned. The hours passed slowly, and the ordinary rhythms of the building offered no comfort. The sense of safety I usually felt at home had evaporated, replaced by the possibility that someone could somehow bypass every security measure, every locked door, every expectation of normalcy, and simply appear outside my window. By the time morning came, the city sounded alive again, ordinary and indifferent. I got up, checked the locks on all the doors and windows, and went to make coffee, trying to absorb myself in routine, to convince myself that last night had been a trick of fatigue and imagination. The hallway outside my apartment was empty, the fire escape still intact, and every window in the building seemed just as it should be. I double-checked the window from the outside, leaning over the ledge carefully, making sure there were no footprints, no traces, nothing. Everything was ordinary, exactly as it should be. When my roommate returned later that day, I told her what had happened, careful to include every detail, every thought, every movement I had made. We checked the hallway together. The fire escape was unused. The neighboring balconies were inaccessible. There was no sign that anyone had been outside my window, yet I knew what I had seen. The shape had been real, the presence had been there, and the impossible positioning of it outside my window made the entire event deeply unsettling. There was no supernatural element, no imagined horror. The reality was just as frightening. Someone, somehow, had appeared where they shouldn't have been, and then vanished. I never found an explanation. The building had security cameras in the lobby, but none covered my window. No one had been seen entering or leaving, and the hallway outside my apartment remained empty, just as I had found it when I checked that night. The thought that someone could be so silent, so precise, so invisible in an ordinary environment made me uneasy for months. I became meticulous about locks, about checking the window before I went to bed, about noticing anything unusual in the street below. I avoided sitting near the window at night, preferring the inner corners of the apartment where I could monitor every entry point. The event stayed with me, lingering in memory every time I was alone in that apartment. There was nothing supernatural about it, nothing that required imagination beyond the ordinary rules of the world. The fear came from the certainty that someone had been there, watching, knowing, and disappearing without leaving a trace. I survived the night without harm, and nothing else happened, but the awareness of vulnerability remained. The experience taught me how quickly a familiar, ordinary place could feel unsafe, how thin the boundary is between security and exposure, and how real fear can exist entirely within the normal, everyday world. Even years later, I remember the shape outside the window in vivid detail. The figure's stillness, the impossibility of its presence, the silence that pressed against my chest while it waited. I remember all of it clearly. I never discovered how it happened, and perhaps I never will. The certainty of its reality, the knowledge that someone had found a way to occupy a space that should have been unreachable, is enough. I learned that fear does not need explanation to be real, and that even in a place that feels secure, the ordinary can shift suddenly into the extraordinary, leaving a lasting impression of vulnerability that cannot be ignored. I was home alone for a few hours after school one Saturday, my parents gone to the grocery store in the late afternoon, leaving the house quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the floorboards. The sunlight was fading, streaking through the windows and casting long, uneven shadows across the living room carpet. I was sprawled on the couch, half watching a rerun on the television, the sound of the actors' voices blending with the soft wind outside, when it began. A sound that immediately made my stomach tighten. It was coming from above, from the roof. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving across the shingles. At first, I froze, certain I had imagined it, because the weight and rhythm didn't match anything I had ever heard before. Squirrels or birds running along the roof were quick and light, almost erratic. This was precise, almost mechanical in its pacing, the sound of someone walking slowly, carefully, but with intent. The noise wasn't constant at first. It would pause, then resume like a measured inspection of every inch of the surface. I realized how exposed the house was. It was a single-story ranch, low and wide, with broad roof panels and no upper floor to separate the sounds from the rest of the house. Every footstep, every pause, resonated through the ceiling into the living room, vibrating faintly through the walls. I wanted to move, to run to the window and peek, but my body froze with a tension I couldn't shake. I pressed myself further into the couch cushions, my heartbeat hammering, ears straining to hear every nuance. Each step had its own pattern. 2 slow steps, a pause, another 3 in sequence, deliberate, heavy. The rhythm suggested someone measuring the distance, testing each step carefully. I told myself that it had to be squirrels or some animal, but my instincts rejected the idea. The weight was far too substantial, the cadence far too controlled. Something was up there, moving, pacing, aware of the space it occupied. I pulled my phone from the coffee table and quietly called my dad, keeping my voice low, my movements minimal. I didn't want to announce my presence, didn't want whoever or whatever was on the roof to hear me fidgeting inside. My dad told me to make sure every door and window was locked, and I did exactly that. I walked slowly through the house, testing the locks, listening as the floorboards beneath my feet groaned with tiny complaints, careful not to make sudden movements. Every door clicked into place, each lock sliding with satisfying precision. Yet the footsteps above continued without interruption, echoing over my careful efforts. The sound lasted for what felt like an eternity. I stayed in my room, crouched near the bed with my phone in hand, listening as the steps traced the roof's edges. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the gutters and shaking loose leaves across the driveway, but the footsteps remained precise and deliberate. Every so often, I would catch a pause, the faint scrape of something dragging across a shingle, and my stomach would tighten further. I imagined someone moving cautiously, perhaps inspecting every part of the house, weighing each movement so as not to make a mistake. I could not see them, could not reach them, and the lack of visibility made the situation far more intense. Eventually, the sound stopped. The The silence that followed was different from the normal quiet of the house. It was charged, heavy, as though the absence of sound carried its own weight. I stayed still, straining for any movement, any hint that the pacing had resumed. Minutes passed, then more, and eventually I built enough courage to move toward the window. The living room light was off, the fading daylight casting long shadows, and I raised the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, switching it on with trembling hands. I scanned the roof carefully, illuminating every edge, every shingle, every vent. The yard beyond was empty. There were no footprints on the low, sloping roof, no broken tiles, no signs of tampering. The gutters were intact, the leaves and debris scattered exactly as they had been earlier that afternoon. Nothing had been disturbed. I traced the flashlight across the roof multiple times, inch by inch, even stepping onto the back porch to get a slightly higher angle. Every corner was empty, pristine, undisturbed. I could not explain it. The weight of the footsteps had been real, the pacing precise, measured. Whatever had produced it was gone, and yet the memory of its movement lingered, as vivid as if I had seen it myself. I double-checked the locks, the doors, the windows, all secure. I walked the perimeter of the house with the flashlight, shining over the lawn, the driveway, the bushes along the fence, but nothing out of place, no signs of forced entry or exit. The footsteps had been real, precise, undeniable, and yet there was no evidence left behind. I spent the rest of the evening on edge, unable to relax on the couch or focus on anything else. Every creak, every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves sent a ripple of tension through me. I imagined someone crouched in the bushes, waiting, inspecting, testing. But when I checked again, nothing. The memory of the pacing roof stayed with me throughout the night. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the fear that the sound would resume, that the precision of those steps might appear again outside, beyond my control. In the morning, my parents returned. I recounted the events in detail, walking them through the sound patterns, the timing, the stops and starts. We checked the house together. Doors, windows, locks, gutters, roof, everything was as it should be. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbance, no evidence of an intruder. The rational explanation escaped me entirely. It hadn't happened again before or since, yet the memory remained vivid, unshakable. I learned something fundamental about perception that day. Fear does not need confirmation, does not need proof beyond experience. It was enough that the footsteps had been there, precise, deliberate, resonant, real in a way that could not be dismissed. The house itself had felt larger, quieter, more vulnerable, and the sense of exposure was exact and unavoidable. I became meticulous about locks, careful about sounds, attentive to the smallest disturbance. The incident changed the way I moved through the house, the way I listened, the way I imagined the possibilities of space beyond my immediate sight. Even now, years later, I remember every detail of that afternoon. The rhythm of the steps, the subtle vibration of the ceiling, the way the shadows shifted as the light faded. There was no supernatural element, no imagined horror. The threat had been real, though invisible, and it had vanished before I could confront it. The experience left a permanent awareness of vulnerability, a lesson in how ordinary spaces can suddenly feel extraordinary, how reality itself can press against your perception, and how precise fear can be when grounded entirely in the believable. I was home alone one night while my family drove 2 hours away to visit my grandmother. The house was quiet in a way that made every sound sharper, every shadow heavier. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 1 a.m., a pale red in the dark kitchen, and I was sitting on the living room couch, scrolling on my phone. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the low creak of the heating system were the only sounds accompanying me. Outside, the night wind stirred the branches of the trees, brushing against the house in a rhythmic scratching that seemed louder in the stillness. I had always felt safe here with my family, but the silence that comes from a house being empty pressed against me in an unfamiliar way. I noticed it first in the reflection of the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. 2 glowing points, perfectly still, staring back at me. I froze, my phone slipping slightly in my hands. At first, I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a coyote, eyes reflecting a streetlight, or a stray dog wandering into the yard. But it didn't move. Not a twitch of a head. Not a shift in position. The eyes were locked on me. My stomach twisted, and my pulse started to pick up. A steady thrum that made the hairs on my arms rise. I set the phone down and grabbed the flashlight from the side table, hesitating before moving closer to the door. My hand pressed against the cool glass, the weight of the moment pinning me in place. I shone the beam across the backyard, illuminating the fence, the tall grass, the garden beds I had tended over the summer. The light revealed nothing. No shape, no fur, no sign of a coyote or any other animal. Only the soft sway of the grass, disturbed as if something had passed through moments before, yet no footprints marked the ground. The soil looked untouched, no indentations, no broken twigs, no tracks at all. I stepped back, breathing shallow and fast, and locked the door behind me. The click of the bolt sounded far too loud in the empty house. I carried the flashlight with me and sat back on the couch, sweeping the beam occasionally across the room and toward the glass door, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Every movement in the backyard felt magnified, exaggerated. The wind brushing through the trees sounded like someone walking, the scrape of a branch against the fence like a footstep on gravel. I kept expecting the glowing eyes to appear again, to peer through the glass, but the yard remained empty. I didn't sleep in my bedroom that night. I stayed on the couch, flashlight at my side, back pressed against the cushions, eyes darting toward the door every few minutes. The wind outside picked up and died down in sudden bursts, rattling the patio chairs and the sliding door frame. Shadows stretched and twisted across the yard, forming shapes that my mind tried to interpret. I imagined someone crouched in the darkness, moving silently, blending into the night, and my heart would spike at the thought. I kept reminding myself that there were locks, that the doors were secure, that the house was on a quiet street with no foot traffic at this hour. Still, the memory of those glowing points lingered, impossible to ignore. I checked every window and door at least 3 times, running my hands over the locks, tapping on the glass to make sure it held firm. The sliding door was sturdy, and the latch clicked into place with reassurance, but I couldn't shake the image of the eyes, staring from a place just beyond reach. I swept the flashlight across the yard repeatedly, inspecting every corner, every bush, every shadow. The grass was bent and swaying in some spots, but the soil was still untouched. There was no sign of entry, no disturbance beyond the subtle impression that something had moved through. Time crawled slowly. I stayed in the living room until dawn, the night stretching endlessly around me. The house creaked in the wind, the refrigerator hummed, and the occasional distant car drove past on the empty street, but nothing approached the backyard. The weight of the darkness pressed against the windows, and every faint sound felt magnified, amplified in a way that made the ordinary seem threatening. I imagined someone pacing just beyond the fence, surveying the house, calculating movements I could not anticipate, and my grip tightened on the flashlight. When morning finally arrived, the pale light softened the backyard into its ordinary state. The wind had died down, the branches stopped scraping, and the grass had settled. I went outside with the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the yard carefully, checking every bush, every flower bed, the fence, and the edges of the house. Nothing had been disturbed. No footprints, no trampled plants, nothing to suggest that someone or anything had been there. The bent grass had flattened on its own, returning to the appearance of the night before. The only evidence of the experience was my own memory, vivid and unnerving. Later, when my family returned, I recounted the night in detail, describing the glowing eyes, the swaying grass, the eerie stillness that followed. We walked the perimeter together, checked the locks, inspected the yard, and found no signs of intrusion. Everything was exactly as it had been. The explanation escaped me entirely. No animal could account for the precise, motionless gaze I had seen. No person could have appeared and vanished without leaving a trace in the soft soil. There was no supernatural element, only the unshakable certainty that something had been there, present, and then gone without evidence. The night left a lingering sense of vulnerability. I became meticulous about locking the doors, checking the backyard from the windows before going to bed, and paying attention to the sounds outside. The experience taught me that ordinary spaces can suddenly feel exposed, that perception can be shaped entirely by subtle, unexplained events. Even though nothing ever happened again, the memory of the glowing eyes and the disturbed grass remained vivid, a reminder that sometimes the world beyond the windows can feel close enough to touch, even if no one is there. I never discovered what caused those eyes to appear or why the grass had swayed, and I never saw anything remotely similar again. The incident remained a precise, isolated memory, unexplainable yet undeniable. I learned to respect the ordinary quiet of the house, to remain alert, and to acknowledge the disquieting truth that not all threats leave evidence, and not all encounters require explanation to be real. That night became a reference point, shaping how I approached being home alone, aware that vigilance was the only reassurance in a world that sometimes presses against the ordinary in ways that feel tangible, precise, and inescapable. I was alone in the apartment that night because my roommate had gone to visit family for Thanksgiving. The place felt emptier than usual, quieter, almost unnatural in its silence. I had spent the evening cooking a small meal for myself, the smell of roasted turkey and garlic lingering in the kitchen long after I'd cleaned the dishes. The living room lights were dim, just the warm glow of the floor lamp by the couch. I kept checking the clock, partly out of boredom, partly out of a subtle unease that I couldn't place. I live in a building that's normally quiet, the kind where people come and go without much noise, but that night the stillness felt heavier, more deliberate, like the air itself was holding its breath. Around 11:30, I was about to sit down with a book when I heard it, a soft knock at the front door. I froze, my stomach tightening. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. The knock wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, a slow, measured tap that immediately set my nerves on edge. I stood up and moved to the door, careful not to make any sudden movements. Pressing my eye to the peephole, I scanned the hallway. No one was there. The building was silent, the hall empty, only the faint hum of the heater at the far end. I backed away from the door, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a maintenance worker or a neighbor just checking the floor. I hadn't ordered anything, so a delivery didn't make sense. I even thought for a moment that I could have imagined it, that my own nerves were playing tricks on me. Then the sound came again. Soft footsteps moving away down the hallway, just beyond my door. They were careful, almost stealthy, deliberate enough that I could tell someone was thinking about where each foot would land. They weren't running or scurrying, just walking slowly, methodically, as if pacing. My heart started hammering, and I immediately grabbed my phone. I called the police, my hands shaking as I explained that someone might be in the building. The dispatcher was calm, professional, asking the usual questions, and telling me to stay inside and lock the door. They mentioned that there were no reports of anyone suspicious in the area, that the building had been quiet all night. That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The silence that returned after I hung up felt heavier, almost suffocating. I stayed pressed against the door for a long time, listening. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the heater, made me jump. I kept checking the peephole, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, waiting. I turned on all the lights, even the overhead kitchen light, and sat on the couch with my back to the wall. The apartment felt like a cage, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but tense, like it's holding secrets. I kept imagining small details, like a shadow outside a window or the glint of metal on the floor. I checked the locks again, one by one, and even double-checked the peephole. Nothing. Hours passed slowly, measured in the tick of the wall clock and the occasional hum from the heater. I stayed awake until the early hours of the morning, moving only to check the windows or glance down the hallway. I didn't sleep, couldn't. When the first week sunlight hit the living room floor, I finally allowed myself to move. My legs were stiff from sitting in the same position, my neck sore from staring at the door. I went to the front door to check the mail, still wary, and that's when I saw it. A small package sitting neatly on the doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a thin string, and there was no return address. It didn't look threatening at first glance, almost ordinary, but something about the way it was placed made my stomach twist. It was directly in the center of the doorway, positioned so deliberately it seemed like someone had set it down slowly, carefully, just the night before. I bent down, careful not to touch it too quickly, examining the wrapping. It was precise, almost meticulous, and the paper itself was slightly crumpled, like it had been carried in someone's hand for a while. There was no label, no note, nothing to hint at what was inside. My first instinct was to call the police again, but I paused, realizing that by the time they arrived, the package would be gone, or worse, it might be tampered with. I put on a pair of gloves from the kitchen drawer and gently lifted it. It was light, and I could feel something inside moving slightly when I shook it gently. My mind raced through possibilities, some logical, most not. I considered neighbors, pranksters, even something from my roommate that I hadn't been told about. Nothing fit. The precision of it, the timing, the way the footsteps had retreated the night before, made it impossible to see this as random. I carried the package into the kitchen, placing it on the counter. I circled it cautiously, looking for seams, markings, anything that would give me a clue. After a long moment, I carefully untied the string and unfolded the paper. Inside was a small stack of photographs. I pulled the top one out slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. It was a picture of my living room, taken from a low angle, the camera capturing exactly where I had been sitting the night before. The next photo showed the hallway outside the door, empty, but with the shadows of the windows reflecting faintly, just as they had been. Each photo was from slightly different angles, all inside my apartment. I set them down, unable to process it fully. Someone had been inside. Someone had been watching. The careful placement of the package, the knocking, the footsteps. All of it suddenly made sense, and the dread I had felt the night before crystallized into sharp clarity. I didn't call anyone. I didn't move the package again. I documented everything, photographing the photos, the wrapping, the precise arrangement, and then I left the apartment for the first time that morning. I stayed with a friend for a couple of days while my roommate returned. The building manager increased security, and I made sure the locks were changed. Nothing else happened after that. The police never found anyone. But I knew that night had not been a coincidence. It had been deliberate, slow, calculated. The package was both a proof and a warning. Told me someone had been inside, and they knew I was home alone. The thought of that, of how close it had been, stayed with me far longer than the photographs themselves. The building felt different after that, every creak and shadow carrying weight. The apartment was the same, familiar, yet it wasn't. I kept the photographs, tucked in a drawer, as a reminder, a record of the night when silence became deliberate, and when the ordinary act of walking down a hallway became something terrifyingly precise. I was alone in the apartment that night because my roommate had gone to visit family for Thanksgiving. The place felt emptier than usual, quieter, almost unnatural in its silence. I had spent the evening cooking a small meal for myself, the smell of roasted turkey and garlic lingering in the kitchen long after I'd cleaned the dishes. The living room lights were dim, just the warm glow of the floor lamp by the couch. I kept checking the clock, partly out of boredom, partly out of a subtle unease that I couldn't place. I live in a building that's normally quiet, the kind where people come and go without much noise, but that night the stillness felt heavier, more deliberate, like the air itself was holding its breath. Around 11:30, I was about to sit down with a book when I heard it, a soft knock at the front door. I froze, my stomach tightening. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. The knock wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. A slow, measured tap that immediately set my nerves on edge. I stood up and moved to the door, careful not to make any sudden movements. Pressing my eye to the peephole, I scanned the hallway. No one was there. The building was silent, the hall empty, only the faint hum of the heater at the far end. I backed away from the door, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a maintenance worker or a neighbor just checking the floor. I hadn't ordered anything, so a delivery didn't make sense. I even thought for a moment that I could have imagined it, that my own nerves were playing tricks on me. Then the sound came again. Soft footsteps moving away down the hallway, just beyond my door. They were careful, almost stealthy, deliberate enough that I could tell someone was thinking about where each foot would land. They weren't running or scurrying, just walking slowly, methodically, as if pacing. My heart started hammering, and I immediately grabbed my phone. I called the police, my hands shaking as I explained that someone might be in the building. The dispatcher was calm, professional, asking the usual questions, and telling me to stay inside and lock the door. They mentioned that there were no reports of anyone suspicious in the area, that the building had been quiet all night. That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The silence that returned after I hung up felt heavier, almost suffocating. I stayed pressed against the door for a long time, listening. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the heater, made me jump. I kept checking the peephole, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, waiting. I turned on all the lights, even the overhead kitchen light, and sat on the couch with my back to the wall. The apartment felt like a cage, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but tense, like it's holding secrets. I kept imagining small details, like a shadow outside a window or the glint of metal on the floor. I checked the locks again, one by one, and even double-checked the peephole. Nothing. Hours passed slowly, measured in the tick of the wall clock and the occasional hum from the heater. I stayed awake until the early hours of the morning, moving only to check the windows or glance down the hallway. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. When the first week sunlight hit the living room floor, I finally allowed myself to move. My legs were stiff from sitting in the same position, my neck sore from staring at the door. I went to the front door to check the mail, still wary, and that's when I saw it. A small package sitting neatly on the doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a thin string, and there was no return address. It didn't look threatening at first glance, almost ordinary, but something about the way it was placed made my stomach twist. It was directly in the center of the doorway, positioned so deliberately it seemed like someone had set it down slowly, carefully, just the night before. I bent down, careful not to touch it too quickly, examining the wrapping. It was precise, almost meticulous, and the paper itself was slightly crumpled, like it had been carried in someone's hand for a while. There was no label, no note, nothing to hint at what was inside. My first instinct was to call the police again, but I paused, realizing that by the time they arrived, the package would be gone, or worse, it might be tampered with. I put on a pair of gloves from the kitchen drawer and gently lifted it. It was light, and I could feel something inside moving slightly when I shook it gently. My mind raced through possibilities, some logical, most not. I considered neighbors, pranksters, even something from my roommate that I hadn't been told about. Nothing fit. The precision of it, the timing, the way the footsteps had retreated the night before, made it impossible to see this as random. I carried the package into the kitchen, placing it on the counter. I circled it cautiously, looking for seams, markings, anything that would give me a clue. After a long moment, I carefully untied the string and unfolded the paper. Inside was a small stack of photographs. I pulled the top one out slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. It was a picture of my living room, taken from a low angle, the camera capturing exactly where I had been sitting the night before. The next photo showed the hallway outside the door, empty, but with the shadows of the windows reflecting faintly, just as they had been. Each photo was from slightly different angles, all inside my apartment. I set them down, unable to process it fully. Someone had been inside. Someone had been watching. The careful placement of the package, the knocking, the footsteps. All of it suddenly made sense, and the dread I had felt the night before crystallized into sharp clarity. I didn't call anyone. I didn't move the package again. I documented everything, photographing the photos, the wrapping, the precise arrangement, and then I left the apartment for the first time that morning. I stayed with a friend for a couple of days while my roommate returned. The building manager increased security, and I made sure the locks were changed. Nothing else happened after that. The police never found anyone. But I knew that night had not been a coincidence. It had been deliberate, slow, calculated. The package was both a proof and a warning. It told me someone had been inside, and they knew I was home alone. The thought of that, of how close it had been, stayed with me far longer than the photographs themselves. The building felt different after that, every creak and shadow carrying weight. The apartment was the same, familiar, yet it wasn't. I kept the photographs, tucked in a drawer, as a reminder, a record of the night when silence became deliberate, and when the ordinary act of walking down a hallway became something terrifyingly precise. I had stayed home alone on a Sunday afternoon because my parents went to visit family. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that stretched across old floorboards and faded wallpaper, making small creaks and groans feel louder than they were. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains in the living room, casting shifting patterns on the hardwood floors. I spent the morning cleaning the kitchen and folding laundry, trying to keep myself busy, but the stillness of the house made every minor sound stand out. Around 4 in the afternoon, I was in the living room, sitting on the couch with my laptop, when I first noticed it, a soft scratching noise coming from somewhere near the kitchen. At first, I thought it was the usual mice. The house was old, over a century, and the occasional mouse was normal. But this sound was different. It was steady, like nails dragging across plaster, and it didn't come from a single place. It seemed to move around, coming from one corner of the wall, then another, sometimes overlapping, as if multiple points inside the wall were active at the same time. The sound had a rhythm to it, deliberate, too consistent for random rodents. I froze, listening. Every other noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, faded into the background. Only the scratching remained, a harsh, grating sound that made my stomach tighten. I stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen, trying to pinpoint it. I pressed my ear against the wall, hoping to catch a better angle. The sound shifted, as if it had moved away from me, yet remained close, echoing from another corner. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my phone and called my dad, explaining what I was hearing. He told me that he hadn't noticed any new signs of pests, that the house had always been prone to small rodents but nothing unusual. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, but my unease didn't fade. I tried to record the sound, holding my phone near the wall with the microphone facing the kitchen. The scratching continued steadily while I pressed the record button, the harsh scraping filling the small recording screen with spikes. I moved around, following the noise as it shifted along the walls, feeling an irrational urge to stay calm. But when I played it back a few minutes later, the sound had vanished completely. The recording was silent, leaving only the faint background hum of the house. I went back to the kitchen, checking every cupboard, the pantry, the corners, even under the sink. Everything looked normal. No movement, no holes, no droppings, nothing. Despite that, the feeling stayed. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched, that something had been inside the walls with me, observing in a way that didn't belong to a mouse. I sat down on the edge of the kitchen counter, the sunlight fading into a dull gray as the afternoon progressed, and tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noises. My imagination was probably exaggerating. Mice could have scurried in multiple directions. Yet, rational thoughts did little to ease the tight knot of anxiety in my chest. Every small creak of the floorboards or shift of the refrigerator door made me jump. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I kept glancing toward the walls, my attention drawn to every shadow and crack. I tried to stay busy, but the constant awareness of the previous sounds made ordinary tasks feel tense. When evening arrived, I made myself a snack and kept the lights on longer than usual, leaving the TV on for background noise. Still, I felt the house differently than before. The walls, the corners, the shadows seemed heavier, somehow charged with the memory of that steady scratching. The sound never returned while I was home, but I couldn't let go of the unease. Over the next few days, even after my parents returned, I felt watched in small ways. I would sit in the living room and notice shadows that didn't align with the sun's movement, small bumps and thumps in the walls that made me pause. Nothing concrete ever happened again. No new holes, no additional noises like that first day, but the memory of it lingered. I found myself checking the corners of the kitchen, tapping the walls, listening closely to the faintest vibrations. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it never went away completely. Weeks passed, and life went on, but the feeling remained. I didn't mention it again to my parents. I didn't want to seem irrational or paranoid, yet I adjusted the way I moved through the house. I kept lights on longer. I avoided standing too close to the kitchen walls when I was alone, and I listened for the faintest signs of disturbance. The house itself didn't change, but my perception of it did. A place that had always felt familiar, comfortable even, now carried the memory of something deliberate, something I couldn't explain. Eventually, the sensation softened, settling into a quiet vigilance rather than constant fear. I learned to live with the small awareness that the walls had once held an unexplainable presence, that the steady, precise scratching had been more than ordinary rodents. The house was unchanged, no damage, no evidence of forced entry, nothing to prove what had happened. And yet I knew. I could feel it in the way the house moved under me, in the way the walls seemed to hold a faint echo of that sound. Just beneath the surface, a reminder that ordinary places can carry small moments of unease long after the noise itself has ended. I never heard the scratching again. Nothing ever appeared in the walls, no new signs of pests, no changes in the structure of the house. But I never forgot it, the way it sounded, the way it shifted, the way it disappeared when I tried to record it. It had been precise, deliberate, and inexplicable, and the memory stayed with me, shaping the quiet afternoons I spent alone, making me aware that the ordinary walls around me could contain something unseen, something just beyond the threshold of perception. It was a small thing, unprovable, but it changed how I experienced the house forever. I was home alone after school that day. My parents had left early for work, leaving me to manage the house until they returned. The air felt heavy and quiet in the usual way, the kind of silence that made ordinary sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, the creak of the floorboards, seemed louder than they actually were. I spent the first part of the afternoon doing homework in the living room, my backpack thrown carelessly on the couch, textbooks open and notes scattered across the coffee table. My dog, a small golden retriever, lay curled up at my feet, breathing evenly, completely relaxed as usual. Around 6:30, I went to the kitchen to grab a snack. The fluorescent ceiling light flickered briefly, and I paused mid-step, glancing toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The hallway was narrow, the walls painted a pale beige, and normally it stretched away from me in quiet monotony. But at that moment, the flicker of the light cast uneven shadows along the walls, shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. That's when I saw it, a dark shape at the far end of the hallway. It was tall and human-shaped, and for a moment, I froze completely. My heart pounded in my chest, my stomach twisting into knots. The silhouette didn't move at first. It stood there, impossibly still, framed by the faint flicker of the overhead light. I thought maybe someone had slipped into the house while my parents were away, but the front door was locked, the windows all closed, and nothing else seemed disturbed. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, slowly, almost unnaturally, the figure began to vanish. It didn't walk away or fade like a shadow under sunlight. It simply receded, shrinking into the wall itself, as if the wall had absorbed it. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the kitchen counter or a piece of furniture. But the shape had been solid, clearly separate from the walls, perfectly human in its proportions, and I had seen it for long enough to recognize the deliberate stance of a figure standing upright. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move. My hands shook slightly as I reached for the light switch, convinced that if I illuminated the hallway fully, the figure would have vanished entirely. The light flickered again as I flipped the switch, and the hallway was empty, ordinary, as if nothing had happened. My pulse was still racing, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The dog, who had been asleep on the floor, lifted its head slowly, ears twitching, nose sniffing the air. Usually calm and obedient, it moved back slightly from the hallway, a low, almost imperceptible growl rumbling from its chest. I froze again, realizing that even the dog had reacted. I spent the next few minutes inspecting the hallway, checking the doors, running my hands along the walls, looking for anything out of place. Footprints, marks, scratches, anything that might explain what I had seen. There was nothing. Everything was as it always was. The floors were clean, the walls unblemished, the doors securely closed. I tried to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light or my imagination, a combination of fatigue and shadows shifting as the fluorescent flickered. But deep down, a lingering unease remained. For the rest of the evening, I avoided looking down the hallway. I kept the lights on, moved through the rooms with deliberate care, and made sure the dog stayed close to me. Every time I passed the hallway, it felt longer, darker, heavier. I could feel the memory of the figure pressing into the space, even though nothing remained. I sat in the living room until my parents returned, trying to keep myself busy with homework and my phone, but my focus kept drifting back to the hallway, the way the shadow had stood there, the way it had receded into the wall. After that day, the dog refused to go down the hallway on its own. Whenever I tried to coax it, it would hesitate at the edge, ears flattened, tail low, staring down the narrow stretch of beige walls as if expecting something to emerge. Even when I carried it partway, it shivered slightly, alert and uneasy. The hallway became a place I approached carefully. I never left doors open in that direction, never lingered there longer than necessary, and always made sure the lights were on. The memory of the silhouette stayed with me, a precise, unnerving image that would come to mind whenever I walked through that part of the house. Weeks passed, and life went on, but the unease didn't fade completely. I developed a habit of glancing down the hallway whenever I entered the living room or kitchen, checking for anything unusual, anything out of place. Nothing ever appeared again. The house remained ordinary, functional, unchanged. There were no signs of forced entry, no marks, nothing that would suggest an intruder had ever been there. The floors were clean, the walls unbroken, and the dog eventually began walking down the hallway again, though with hesitation, ears alert, glancing at the corners as it went. I eventually accepted that what I had seen was likely a trick of perception, a combination of light, shadow, and the natural tension of being home alone. Yet the memory persisted. I could still picture the figure clearly, the way it had stood at the end of the hallway, its human proportions, its slow disappearance into the wall. Even though I knew it had likely been a visual anomaly, the image remained vivid, a reminder of how small and unprepared one could feel in familiar surroundings. The house itself had not changed. The walls, the floors, the narrow hallway remained the same. And yet, for a long time after that day, I moved through the space differently, with awareness, with caution, carrying with me the certainty that ordinary places could feel unfamiliar and strange in an instant. The dog's reaction had confirmed it in a way I couldn't deny. Something about that hallway, that brief moment, had altered the way I perceived the house. It was ordinary, safe, familiar, and yet it had held a brief, inexplicable presence that left a lasting impression. I never saw the figure again. The lights continued to flicker occasionally, as old fixtures will, but nothing else happened. The hallway returned to normal in appearance, and the dog slowly regained confidence. Yet every time I passed it, I felt the faintest hesitation, a whisper of that afternoon, a reminder that even the most familiar spaces can carry an echo of something that feels deliberate, human-shaped, and entirely out of place. The image of the silhouette never left me, and for years after, I moved through that part of the house with careful attention, aware of every shadow, every flicker of light, and every subtle shift in the familiar walls. I stayed alone in our family cabin for a few nights one late summer. The cabin is deep in the woods, far from the nearest road, with only the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of distant birds to fill the quiet. My parents had left for a weekend trip, and I wanted the solitude. The cabin itself is small, built on stilts because the land slopes sharply toward the creek behind it. The walls are weathered wood, rough and faded from years of exposure, and the porch boards creak under even the lightest step. During the day, the place feels peaceful, isolated in a way that is comforting, almost like it exists outside of time. At night, the isolation takes on a heavier character. On the second night, I went to bed earlier than usual, around 10:30, after cooking a small dinner and making sure the cabin was tidy. The moon was high and thin, casting silvery light through the windows. I left the porch light on, the one above the door, which usually gave the small clearing a soft, familiar glow. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind against the siding, brushing the cabin with dry leaves. But then I realized it was different. It was scraping, deliberate and slow, coming from somewhere along the outer walls. The sound had a rhythm to it, like claws dragging across the wood. I froze, listening, trying to convince myself it was a branch, a loose piece of bark brushing against the siding. But the scraping moved along the walls, rising and falling in volume as it traveled. The cabin is raised on stilts, so any creature outside would have to climb, at least partially, to reach the walls near the windows. That realization made my heart beat faster. I grabbed the flashlight I keep near the bed, its weight solid in my hand, and carefully stepped onto the floorboards. I moved toward the main window, pressing the glass lightly with my hand. The scraping stopped the moment I shined the flashlight across the clearing. I walked along the side of the cabin, the boards under my feet creaking with each step. I swept the light over the surrounding trees, the tall grass, the steep slope leading to the creek. Nothing moved. No shadows, no branches, nothing that could explain the sound I had heard. The only light was from the moon and the weak beam of my flashlight, casting long, distorted shapes against the trees. I circled the cabin slowly, every instinct urging me to hurry, but I wanted to be methodical, to be certain. When I reached the far side, the beam of the flashlight caught something along the siding. Faint scratches, shallow but clear, running vertically in places and along the seams of the boards. They hadn't been there the day before. I crouched, examining them more closely. The wood was rough, splintered slightly at the edges of the scratches, as if something sharp had deliberately clawed at it. There was no way a branch or small animal could have made marks like these so high up on the wall, in places that required climbing or stretching. I pressed my hand against the wood, feeling the faint texture of the scratches, the rough splinters catching lightly under my fingers. I stood up slowly, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I scanned the surrounding trees again, my flashlight sweeping over the clearing. The moonlight gave the forest a silver haze, the shadows shifting with the breeze. I couldn't see anything moving, yet the scratches were proof that something had been there, something that had left a deliberate mark on the cabin. I ran my hand through my hair, feeling a cold tension settle over me. I didn't know whether it had been an animal or a person. The area is remote, and the nearest neighbor is miles away. It didn't make sense. I returned to the porch, keeping the light on, and sat with the flashlight resting on my knees. I kept glancing toward the dark edges of the clearing, toward the tree lean, imagining shapes moving, crouching, waiting. The sound didn't return, but the memory of it, the scraping along the wood, pressed against my mind with a sharp insistence. I could feel the quiet weight of the woods, the emptiness around the cabin, and I realized how vulnerable the cabin, raised though it was, could be. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed seated on the porch, the flashlight sweeping slowly over the dark clearing. My dog, usually calm and sleepy, lying close to my feet, alert, ears twitching at every faint noise. The cabin's boards creaked, the wind rustled through the trees, and every sound made me flinch. I tried to stay logical, convincing myself that the scratching could have been caused by a branch snagging a board, or perhaps an animal climbing something in the shadows. But the marks on the siding, deliberate and high, told me otherwise. Morning arrived slowly, the first pale light creeping across the clearing and filtering through the windows. I walked around the cabin again in the daylight, inspecting the scratches from the night before. They were more obvious now, the rough splinters catching in the sunlight, the lines irregular but clearly deliberate. Nothing else appeared disturbed. The clearing was empty, the trees still, the grass untouched. The cabin looked peaceful, almost normal in the broad light of day. I took a few photographs of the scratches and made a mental note to show my parents. Despite the daylight, I felt a lingering unease. The weight of the previous night, the awareness that something or someone had climbed along the walls, stayed with me. I packed my belongings quickly, not even bothering to enjoy the quiet solitude I had come for. The cabin that had felt peaceful in the afternoon now felt exposed, the shadows of the trees stretching long and unfamiliar, the sounds of the wind whispering differently. I left that morning, the car crunching along the gravel path, the remote forest closing silently behind me. I didn't return to the cabin for several months. The scratches faded slightly in my memory, but the sense of unease remained. Every time I think of that night, I remember the scraping, deliberate and precise, the faint texture on the siding, the way the cabin, raised and isolated though it was, suddenly seemed vulnerable. The marks were real, the sound had been real, and that knowledge stayed with me far longer than the brief glimpse of what had happened in the darkness. The cabin is still there, raised and weathered, but the memory of that night is what I carry. The awareness that even in a place as remote and solitary as that, someone or something could leave a presence subtle and undeniable against the ordinary walls of the building.